Today's video is going to be a shorter one. I'm going to talk about Robert Paul Bauer, the first person to be murdered by Sean Sellers in 1985. Before I posted my video, The Case of Sean Sellers Revisited, in 2022, the world outside his hometown of Akron, Ohio, and those who'd known him, had never seen a photo of him in life. Because Lee and Vonda Bellafato were Sellers' parents, more was known and published about their lives, although both were still reduced to secondary characters in the Sellers verse. But Robert Bauer was a random stranger, and his death was already an afterthought by the time the Sellers story began to make the news, so he was barely acknowledged beyond his occupation, and was only ever shown in crime scene photos. I wanted to correct this in my original video. I was able to get in contact with some of Robert's family members, and I got a lot of helpful information. Communication dropped off before I was able to ask about everything I'd hoped to, but today I'd like to share his life story as best I can, because his moment of recognition is long overdue. Also, Bob gave me permission to tell his story. But maybe that's a story for another day. The Bauer family had already experienced more than their fair share of tragedy when Leslie and Alberta, Bertie, two loved ones, gave birth to their third and youngest child, Robert Paul, on July 8, 1949, in Akron, Ohio. Leslie Bauer Jr. had lost his own mother, Allie, at age 13, and a brother, Herman, had died at age 3. Leslie and Bertie's first child, Jack, died in first grade due to complications from a tonsil surgery. Leslie and Bertie also had a daughter, Carolyn, who was 8 when Bob was born. The Bauers had established a multi-generational tradition of careers in industrial work in Akron, with Bob's father and grandfather, Leslie Bauer Sr., both working the same manufacturing jobs into retirement age. The Bauers also had a tradition of military service. Leslie Sr. served as a Marine from 1900 to 1904, while Leslie Jr. was a World War II veteran with the Army. An outgoing and opinionated man, Leslie Jr. was quick to tell of the distinguishments he'd earned, including the Purple Heart and the Battle Star for his participation in Germany. Around age 16, Carolyn Bauer was sexually assaulted by multiple perpetrators, and as a result of complications from the trauma was placed into inpatient psychiatric care. She would continue to experience severe mental illness throughout the rest of her life and require varying levels of supportive living until she passed away in 2010. One of the complications that Carolyn struggled with was that her assailants were black, which is said to have been a major motivator for Leslie and Bertie to have her initially placed. This experience had to have been impactful on 8-year-old Bob. By age 14, he was sent to live with family on his mother's side in Pennsylvania, but was back in Akron by 16. Around this time, he posted a classified ad offering general labor, noting he's saving up for trade school. It's uncertain if he took any vocational training after high school. On June 17, 1970, Bob enlisted in the United States Army. Given his education level and family background, he likely entered as an E1 private. After completing training, he remained full-time, active duty. To the best of my knowledge, Bob was never deployed and remained stateside throughout his service. On December 21st of the same year, he married 17-year-old Cheryl Hosey at Mogador Baptist Church in Talmadge, Ohio. The following year, they gave birth to a daughter, Tracy. The family lived on one of the bases near Canton, but by May 26, 1972, Bob had filed notice in the local paper of financial absolvement of the relationship, and a divorce soon followed. After Bob left, Cheryl's life continued on a downward spiral. A newspaper report from 1974 indicates the single mother was arrested after she and a male she was cohabitating with broke into an 82-year-old woman's home, robbed her, and threw her down a staircase. She would marry her second husband the following year, and the two would have a second daughter, Stephanie, before divorcing. She married for a third and final time to Roger Sutherland, and though she kept her married name, they separated within a couple years. Cheryl developed a drinking problem as she continued to struggle to maintain a stable employment and often had to stay one step ahead of landlords as evictions were frequent. On October 27, 1989, the 33-year-old had gotten off an overnight shift at Stay Right in Waterford, Wisconsin, when she and two co-workers stopped for drinks at a tavern. Around 8:30 a.m., the vehicle she was driving veered off Highway 20 outside Dover, killing Cheryl and injuring the two passengers. 17-year-old Tracy, still in her senior year of high school, had to assume guardianship of her 14-year-old sister. By 1974, Bob had transferred to Fort Bliss, where he met Deborah Kendrick, a 23-year-old in El Paso, Texas. Debbie was also a divorcee, having married her first husband in 1971. The two married in 1975 in Debbie's family's hometown, Alvarado, and had a son, Jeffrey, that same year in El Paso. Bob was honorably discharged on April 12, 1978, at the rank of E5 Sergeant. His relationship with Debbie had broken down sometime around then or within the next couple years. His length of service and his promotion in rank in a stateside post through 5 years of the Vietnam War suggests that the structure of the Army was an environment he thrived relatively well in, as his circumstances would only get worse in civilian life. Bob struggled to establish a life for himself after the Army and Debbie. In 1981, he returned to Akron for a family reunion. Leslie and Bertie were still actively involved in Tracy and Cheryl's life, in spite of Bob's absence. They went to considerable lengths to keep their granddaughter from getting to know her loser father, in Leslie's words. Cheryl was married but separated from her third husband, and still cared enough for Bob to want to try to help him when she saw him at the reunion, gaunt and visibly troubled. It may have also been the tattoo on his upper left arm, Bob and Cheryl, wrapped around a panther's head, that triggered some sentiment for her. Against Leslie and Bertie's wishes, Cheryl brought Bob back with her to Milwaukee, where she was living at the time. Bob stayed in homeless shelters in the Milwaukee area, while Cheryl did what she could to help him find employment as well as offer emotional support. As a single parent already supporting 2 children herself, she could only do so much for him, and after about a month, Bob returned to Akron. After recovering from hernia surgery while staying with his parents in Akron, Bob set out to make his way back to Texas to reunite with Debbie and Jeff. Bob and Debbie had never officially divorced. Accounts conflict as to how long, if at all, Bob was back in Texas, but by 1982 he was said to be stranded in Oklahoma City. Bob stayed in shelters and various shared living arrangements as he worked a string of low-paying jobs. Friends in Oklahoma City described him as somewhat of a loner, insecure, and often irritable, yet reportedly attracted women fairly easily. He worked as a donut fryer at Safeway for about a year, when he and coworker Sally Harrow began dating. They lived together for about 6 months, but Bob's temper was often set off by her crying infant, so he ended up finding a small apartment in nearby Edmond. On June 13, 1985, Bob began working overnight shifts at the Circle K at 122nd and Council Road. His 1976 Chevy Nova barely made the 12-mile commute from Edmond, but for the first time in years, Bob had steady employment and independent housing. On the night of Saturday, September 7th, 1985, Bob clocked in for his shift. About half an hour later, 2 16-year-olds, Richard Howard and Sean Sellers, came into the store and began loitering for an extended period of time. At one point, without warning, Sellers pulled out a .357 Magnum and fired several shots at Bob, leaving him bleeding to death on the floor of the store. Sellers would later claim Richard Howard tried unsuccessfully to open the cash register, but the two left afterwards without taking any merchandise. The lack of an apparent robbery motive or any viable leads resulted in the homicide investigation going cold until March 5th, 1986, when Lee and Vonda Belafato were found shot to death in their Oklahoma City home. After Richard Howard agreed to turn state's evidence against Sellers in exchange for a plea deal, Sellers ultimately confessed to murdering the three. Over the years, Sellers gave several rationale for murdering Robert Paul Bauer, a man whose name he didn't even know until trial. But the only explanation that holds up is that he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone.